They are denied access to education available to other children. Indeed, UNICEF has estimated that some around 90% children with disabilities in the developing areas do not attend schools. In order to finish with this such injustice, in 2006 was adopted the UN CRPD Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This new UN Convention stresses the need to overcome discrimination and recognize the rights to full participation of children with disabilities in all areas of society life. Before that, another convention on the rights of child was adopted and had already recognized and promoted the rights of children with disabilities. Despite the adoption of these agreements, children with disabilities continue to be discriminated in all parts of the world. It doesn't matter, developed or developing countries. I represent Disability Council International. It is the NGO that works for the promoting of human rights of persons with disabilities. On a daily basis, recognize that boys and girls with disabilities are exposed to a greater degree to abuse, neglect, and exploitation, violence, and exclusion from support and services in emergencies created by armed conflicts. Yet it is in these circumstances more than in any other cases that the UN CRPD Convention stresses the need for the parties in conflict to uphold their obligations to take not just feasible, but all the necessary measures to ensure the protection and safety for children with disabilities. The CRPD Convention, therefore, complements and reinforces the relevant norms of international humanitarian law with regard to the situation of children with disabilities during armed conflicts. The UN Security Council and the UN Human Rights Council on various occasions have stressed that parties to armed conflict are responsible for ensuring the protection of affected civilians, including the specific needs of persons with disabilities and children in particular. What needs to be done to minimize the negative impact of conflict on children's rights and to reduce the exclusion of boys and girls with disabilities in managing situations of risk during armed conflicts? First of all, it is important to conduct, starting from the beginning of the armed conflict, started to conduct data collection and provide information in accessible way. Parties to an armed conflict are required to collect data, including disaggregating data regarding boys and girls with disabilities in place under their control. Data collected in this way helps in the design and implementation of the most effective risk reduction strategies for the benefit of children with disabilities, to facilitate their needs, tailored access to water, food, clothing, shelter. The CRPD Committee has on various occasions stressed the need in emergencies to conduct the systematic registration of internally displaced people with disabilities, including children with disabilities, and to ensure and prioritize the safety of children with disabilities in conflict-affected areas, in particular those placed in institutions. Likewise, information to children with disabilities needs to be provided in accessible formats that meet the needs of everyone, including those with visual, intellectual, or hearing impairments, in line with provisions of the CRPD Convention. Let's consider now the question of inclusive and accessible evacuation strategies. When an emergency situation occurs, International law encourages the parties to the conflict to evacuate civilians to the safety zones. In doing so, the Disability Convention requires that special attention is paid to needs of children with disabilities, including those placed in institutions, as they are more likely to be overlooked by evacuation strategies, either for lack of accessible timely information on evacuation plans or for lack of accessible means of transportation, and in general for lack of efficient contingency plans. In disseminating information about evacuation plans, the new information technologies can be helped, such as mobile phones, social media, and other internet facilities accessible to children with disabilities and their family members. In proceeding with evacuation strategies, children with disabilities should not be separated from their family members. Let's move now to the need for inclusive and accessible sheltering strategies. Once children with disabilities have been evacuated, it is important to ensure that the new sheltering facilities are inclusive of children with disabilities and meet their relevant provisions, relevant needs consistent with relevant provisions of the Disability Convention, requiring that adequate living conditions are granted to persons with disabilities and children in particular, also in emergency wartime situations. This implies the provision of accessible shelters, education facilities, food, healthcare and rehabilitation assistance, and family tracing services, among other humanitarian assistance. Because of the negative emotional impact on children that lost their parents, parties to a conflict should do their best to facilitate family reunification. In doing so, attention should be paid to the particular support needs of children with different forms of impairments and their psychological states as a result of potential distress caused by violence on them or their family members. International law also requires that in granting access to food and sanitation facilities, the relevant needs of persons with disabilities, and in particular the children with disabilities, are taken in due account, so that those with physical impairments, for example, are not prevented from reaching these facilities. Particular attention is to be paid to the situation of separated from families, boys and girls with different forms of and degrees of impairment. Access to health and rehabilitation services. Concerning these issues, it is important to emphasize that the Disability Convention requires that in situation of armed conflict, as much as in peacetime, different accessible and culturally appropriate health and rehabilitation services are provided to boys and girls with disabilities without discrimination. Support should also be provided to children with disabilities in need of relief from stress, anxiety, and other types of psychological trauma as a result of the armed conflict. Concerning this, one of the most fundamental rights of a child is right to education. And education should be, schools should be guaranteed in the shelters that children are placed. And education should be, like it is according to the convention, should be inclusive education for children with disabilities, also in the shelters. As I mentioned at the beginning, boys and girls with disabilities are more vulnerable to violence and abuse in conflict situations, especially if they are left alone without parents. In temporary sheltering facilities, it is important that those children are identified and adequate assistance is provided by relevant child protection mechanisms to protect them from harm. This mechanism must be easily accessible to all children with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very thorough. Thank you.